Hi, I'm Derek Kilmer, State Senator for the 26th District, which goes from the Narrows Bridge to downtown Bremerton. Recently I had my town hall meetings. I had 3 of them, and we had a terrific turnout, about 60 people in Bremerton, another 60 people in Port Orchard, and nearly 100 in the Gig Harbor area. We had a terrific discussion of what's happening with our state's economy. We looked at how that economic downturn is affecting the state's budget challenges, and then we talked a lot about what we should do about it. Really enjoyed having citizens get engaged in what's happening in their government, and certainly appreciate the folks who showed up. For those who weren't able to make it to my town hall meeting, I thought it would be valuable to lay out some of the information that I tried to share along with Representative Sequist in looking at what's happening in our economy. So thought I would share some of that information with you. Our starting point of the conversation was looking at how this recession has been different from some of the previous recessions. You've seen, and on the chart that we're showing here, it looks a little like a bunch of spaghetti thrown on a sheet of paper, but really what you see is that red line is the recession that we're currently in. And you will see that this recession has been deeper in terms of jobs lost and longer in terms of how long we've seen that trough than any recession in modern history. The impact of that has been, in terms of employment, a much larger number of folks who have been long-term unemployed than ever in recent history. There is a lot of our friends and neighbors who've been unemployed for well over half a year now. Looking at Washington specifically, you can see that we've seen in recent years a real dip in employment growth, and in fact have gone negative in 2009 and 2010. What that means in terms of our unemployment rate is, again, you've seen unemployment spike in recent years. The projection is that it will go down, but you can see that we're not going down anywhere near sort of pre-recession levels. You still have rather high unemployment rates expected in both 2012 and 2013. Our state, over the course of this recession, lost nearly 200,000 jobs. We're starting back on the uptick now, but have only gained about 20,000 of those jobs, so we still have a long way to go in terms of catching up with where we were prior to this recession. So how does this interact with the state budget? Well, you know, if you look at where the state tax revenues come from, a pretty substantial slug of it is from sales tax. And folks aren't shopping as much as had been expected by the state's economists, so you see a continued downturn in sales tax revenue. About 1/3 of the state's sales tax revenue comes from things like things related to new homes, either construction of new homes or buying things like refrigerators and freezers and washers and dryers and those sorts of things. All of that's down. About 10% of the state's sales tax revenue comes from automobile sales, and that's down too. You can see on the chart here, B&O has nothing to do with body odor. That's the business and occupation tax, and that's the tax that our employers pay. As our employers struggle through this economy, the receipts related to the business and occupation tax are down as well. And you can see what this means in terms of the impact to the state's revenue. In both 2009 and 2010, revenues were down. The state made that up in recent budgets, both through a combination of fund transfers and with help from the federal government that, as we look at this upcoming biennium, simply won't be there. Washington's not alone in this. 48 of the 50 states have budget shortfalls right now. The 2 that don't are Montana and North Dakota. Largely because they stand on on mineral deposits. I've been trying to dig in my backyard, but so far nothing. Just really a bunch of sand. As we look at this upcoming biennium, you really see 2 things. One, you saw already a shortfall between now and the end of this fiscal year, which ends at the end of June. And then going forward for the next biennium, you have about a $5.1 billion shortfall, and recently that number actually got worse with the most recent revenue forecast. So the hole is big, and the hole is really driven by two things. One, revenues not increasing at the rate that had been expected, and two, what's called caseloads, which is really where your tax dollars go. The shorthand that gets used in Olympia is your tax dollars go to what's called the 3/8. They go to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. And unfortunately, during an economic downturn, the demand for all 3/8 goes up. You see more people committing crimes, ending up in prisons, and that costs you money. You see more people out of work and dependent on the state for social and health services, and that costs you money. And you even see it in education, where kids who had been in homeschool or in private school, mom and dad can't afford that anymore, and so they are now in our public schools, and that costs you money. And even in higher education, every community college in the state of Washington right now is at record enrollment, and that costs you money. And so you see a shortfall expected for the upcoming biennium. I want to put in real dollar terms, when we talk about, over $5 billion of a budget hole, what does that mean? So, for example, you could, and I wouldn't, you could close every higher education institution in the state. UW, WSU, Eastern, Western, Central, the Evergreen State College, and all of our community and technical colleges in the state, and you wouldn't get to solving half of the state's budget problem. You could close every correctional facility in the state, and while you're at it, you could shut down all of the state's environmental programs. You could close the Department of Natural Resources, you could shut down the Department of Ecology, and I know a few people who'd like us to do that. You could close every state park, you could end all of the state's clean water and clean air programs, and having done all of that and combine it with shutting down the state's entire higher education system, you still wouldn't solve the state's budget problem for the next biennium. So it gives you a sense of just the magnitude of the challenge that the state faces. Let's talk a little bit about how the governor proposed solving the budget hole. You can see on the chart the bar that says low-income health care. Those are programs like the state's basic health program that provide health care for working people whose employers don't provide health care. And the governor proposes eliminating that program altogether. It also includes programs like the state's Disability Lifeline that provides medical services for people who aren't able to work. Under that bucket called Other Human Services, that includes things like corrections. It also includes long-term care services for our seniors. That's things like funding for the state's nursing homes and services for people with developmental disabilities, mental health funding, and I've met recently, and we had a lot of folks from Kitsap Mental Health Services show up at our town hall meetings. Mental health services are really impacted in the governor's budget. The middle column is K through 12. And though on a percentage basis, that's a shorter bar than the others in terms of real dollar amounts, the governor's budget proposes cutting K through 12 by $1.7 billion. That means not funding the two education initiatives, the class size initiative and the cost of living adjustment for our educational employees. It means not funding bonuses for our national board certified teachers. It means not funding what's called kindergarten through 4th grade enhancement dollars, which try to keep our class sizes down for our little kids, like my daughter who will be entering kindergarten next year. All of that is affected in that K4 column. Higher education is very deeply impacted in the governor's budget with cuts to each of the institutions, both our 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities, as well as some of the financial aid programs. In the governor's budget, some of those cuts are mitigated by tuition increases, double-digit tuition increases at all but the regional institutions, where she proposes a 9% tuition increase. Under all other, that sounds pretty innocuous, but that's things like eliminating almost all state funding for our state parks, falls under all other. It means in the governor's budget proposing the closure of the Washington State History Museum. That falls under all other. So things that in any normal year would be considered front page news just kind of get thrown into the mix along with the other substantial cuts that the state's contemplating. So what do we do? Well, I've been hearing from a lot of folks suggesting that the answer is to close tax loopholes, and certainly the state's having a conversation about some of those. I will tell you that some of the tax loopholes that are on the books make a lot of sense. Things like, for example, you know, when you and I go to the grocery store and we buy our broccoli, it's not made, buying broccoli isn't made more painful by having to pay sales tax on it. I already find it painful enough to have to eat broccoli, but to pay sales tax on top of that would be particularly painful. And so that is a tax loophole, if you want to call it that, but that's one that probably makes some sense. There are some that may not make sense that the state is evaluating right now and looking at. For example, the state has a tax break for bedding for chicken coops. And at a time where the state is contemplating cutting beds in nursing homes, maybe it doesn't make sense to have a tax break for beds for chicken coops. I will point out, though, that even looking at the closure of tax loopholes is challenging in that it requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature or sending it to the voters through referendum with the passage of Initiative 1053. Anything that is revenue generating, even the closure of a tax break, would require a vote of the people or 2/3 vote of the legislature. To some degree, as we approach this budget solution, part of this is about trying to set some priorities, and let me tell you mine. First, we have a constitutional obligation to invest in education, and I would argue we also have an economic imperative to do that. It is the smartest investment our state makes. The dollars we invest in making sure our kids get a good education are dollars we save down the road in prisons and unemployment and social services. Second, I would argue we have a moral obligation to provide services for those most vulnerable in our state. I, for instance, spent a lot of time working on services for people with developmental disabilities, and I believe we have a moral obligation to people to make sure that they can live with dignity. Third, we have to protect public safety. As a dad, I want to make sure that we're maintaining safe communities throughout our state. And then finally, we have to make sure that the state is using the dollars it has as efficiently as possible. So let me end by talking kind of broadly about where I think this is going to head and where I'd like to see it head. First, we have got to look at the very least at eliminating some of the non-essentials within state government. And taking cuts where it makes sense to take cuts. So, for example, you know, part of that is with regard to legislative budgets. Those of you watching this at home or on your computer will know that you haven't gotten a newsletter from me this year. You haven't gotten a newsletter mailed to you. And that is because the legislature is taking cuts to its own budget, including our newsletter budgets, which are one of the ways we've historically tried to keep folks informed. That also includes, we passed a bill out of our Ways and Means Committee to privatize the state's print shop. At a time where we're looking at these dramatic cuts in education and the health safety net, perhaps it doesn't make sense for the state to be spending money on a print shop when there's plenty of printers in the private sector who could probably serve that function more efficiently. And it would probably be good for our state's economy to provide those opportunities within the private sector. Second, we're looking at reform opportunities to really change how the state is doing business. So, for example, in a prior video update, I talked a little bit about the Debt Reduction Act of 2011, which is looking at trying to reform how the state takes on debt and reduce how much of the state's operating budget is going into debt service. We're also looking at some efficiencies within our higher education system, trying to look for efficiencies within middle management and those sorts of reforms as well. And then finally, and I'll wrap up with this, if we're going to get this budget taken care of over the long term, what we really need to do is we need to get people back to work. When the economy is moving forward, it means less demand for state services, and it means the state's revenue picture looks a whole lot better. And so part of the reason you've seen an effort over this legislative session to make some reforms to our state's unemployment insurance system is because that is important to our employers as they look to keep their lights on. Part of the reason you've seen some efforts around the state's workers' comp system to both maintain protections to legitimately injured workers, but also to try to reduce costs in the short term and in the long term to employers, is because we've got small businesses in our state and large businesses in our state that are struggling to keep their lights on. And if they don't, it will make the state's budget challenges even worse. Part of the reason you're seeing an effort to improve the business climate, part of the reason you've heard me talk about making smart investments in infrastructure, is that we've got to get the private sector economy moving forward again. And so having those sorts of systems in place are going to be really important to getting the economy moving and improving the state's budget outlook. And then finally, part of the reason it makes sense for us to make smart investments in workforce development is that we want to make sure that people have the skills that are needed so that they can take on the jobs that are going to come available as this economy starts to pick up again. That's how we're going to get out of this budget challenge. And I think that's the path forward, not just for this year, but also for years to come. So that is a brief, but not too brief, overview of what's happening with the state budget, what's happening with our economy, and what we can do going forward. I look forward to sitting down again soon and giving an update on what else is happening here in Olympia.